theatricality and deception. Powerful agents to the uninitiated, but we are initiated.
I'm super excited!
Y'all shut up now!
What's up, you guys? It's your late night into the AM conspiracy theorist with the best conspiracy theories on any social media platform. That's right, Conspired Deception. Oh yeah.
Ha! Gay!
You've stumbled upon the only channel that climbs to the highest parts of the untraveled earth, swim through the deepest depths of the ocean, and discover uncharted territories as we travel through space and time, just to bring you this brand new special event.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
Wait a minute, that's not right.
Welcome to Conspired Deception Official.
The Great Depression was the most severe and enduring economic collapse of the 20th century. It was a worldwide economic breakdown, symbolized in the United States by the stock market crash on what's referred to as Black Thursday, October 24, 1929. The cause of the Depression was because of many varied reasons, but the impact was visible across the country. As stocks continued to fall during the early 1930s, businesses failed and unemployment rose dramatically. By 1932, 1 in every 4 American workers were unemployed. Banks failed and life savings were lost, leaving many Americans desperate. With no jobs and no money, hundreds of thousands of families lost their homes. The struggle was real and the options were limited. After losing their homes, Americans had to settle in little ran-down shacks. Most of the American people and their families lost everything they had after the banks kicked them out of their homes. What they didn't lose, they slowly began to sell, anything of value. Eventually, the small income was gone. Some people resorted to finding what little jobs they could, but sadly, not many. Some people turned to violence and crime, and many starved to death. But some families ran out of options completely, and was forced to sell things that meant the most to them, their most prized possessions. Depending on the surrealness of the situation, some was even forced to do the unthinkable. They sold their very own children. For reasons relatable or not, things were not always butterflies and rainbows. Sometimes the children went through some of the worst unthinkable trauma, within unspeakable acts not for the faint of heart. So join me as we follow one unlucky family's journey, as the history lurks between some of the darkest corners hidden within America's Great Depression, one of the darkest times in human history. But what could cause someone to be so desperate that they would sell their very own children? And what would have become of the children? Well, look no further. You can find your answers right here, right now, on this exciting episode of Debunking History's Mysteries on Conspired Deception.
Hey kids, are you tired of the same old boring history? Yikes. Well, do I have a surprise for you? Get ready for the same old boring history, but with a unique and modern day twist. Conspired Deception presents a brand new exciting series packed full of lies, cover-ups, aliens, giants, war, technology, murder, and much more. A Conspired Deception original. A coming era of conspiracies, doing the research so you don't have to, looking through evidence to separate facts from fiction, saying what needs to be said so you don't get the backlash, debunking history's mysteries. Finally, a show to dumb down the facts so it becomes easier to understand. Debunking History's Mysteries, the only series that debunks theories, right here at Conspired Deception Official.
In 1948, a photo was published, and the image was taken featuring a Chicago woman advertising to sell her 4 children. It is presented to be one of perhaps the most distressed and shocking moments ever captured. To understand these actions, we must first step back and look at the circumstances that would cause a mother to sell her children. First, we must understand what things were like for the average American person living during the Depression. The Great Depression began in 1929 and ended in 1939, lasting nearly a decade. It was a severe global economic downturn that affected many countries across the world, and it became clear that after a sharp decline in stock prices in the United States, it led to a period of the economic depression. The economic infection marked the start of a prolonged period of economic hardship characterized by high unemployment rates and widespread business failures. While families suffered, empires grew, and as the rich got richer, the poor only got poorer. Cities around the world were hit hard, especially those dependent on heavy industries. Construction was virtually halted in many countries. Farming communities and rural areas suffered as crop prices fell by 60%. Faced with plummeting demands and fewer job alternatives, areas dependent on primary sector industries suffered the most. Between the peak and the tough of the downturn, industry productions in the United States declined 47%. Real gross domestic products, GDP, fell 30%, and wholesale prices index declined 33%. The negative effects of the Depression lasted until the beginning of World War II. Devastating effects were seen in both the rich and the poor communities, with falling personal income, prices, tax revenues, and profits. International trade fell more than 50%. Unemployment in the U.S. rose to 23%, and in some countries it rose as high as 33%. Immediately following the stock market crash, there were so many suicides in New York's financial district that reportedly one hotel clerk would ask guests if they needed a room for sleeping or needed a room for jumping. All across the country, suicide rates skyrocketed as people lost their homes, farms, jobs, savings, everything. Economic historians usually consider the devastating Wall Street crash less as a cause of the Depression and more of a symptom of rising nervousness of investors, partly due to gradual price declines caused by failing sales of customer goods. Multiple factors led to the Depression itself, including the U.S. stock market crash and the widespread failure of the American banking system, both of which helped destroy confidence in the nation's economy. The timing and severity of the Depression varied substantially across the country. It was particularly long and severe in the United States and Europe, but it was milder in Japan and much of Latin America. Perhaps, not surprisingly, reasons regarding and declines in consumer demands, financial panics, political gain, and misguided government policies caused economic output to fall in the United States. The world's unemployment not only peaked at nearly 30% in 1932, but remained in the double digits throughout the decade. German and U.S. production dropped to 53%. One nation after another abandoned the gold standard in 1930. Many families sought to cope by planting gardens, canning foods, buying used bread, and using cardboard and cotton for their shoes. Despite a steep decline in food prices, many families did without milk or meat. In New York City, milk consumption declined 1 million gallons a day. With no jobs and no savings or income, thousands of Americans lost their homes, and more than 15 million people were out of work. As time went on, desperate for shelter, the poor congregated in cardboard shacks. Millions of families built shantytowns in and around cities across the nation. These camps came to be known as Hoovervilles, named after the President Hoover. As the Depression worsened, many looked to the federal government for assistance. When the government failed to provide assistance, the president of the time became very unpopular, and the highly unpopular Hoover was defeated in 1932 at the presidential election by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And Roosevelt's New Deal recovery programs later eventually helped lift the United States out of the Depression. Hooverville shanties were constructed of cardboard, tar paper, glass, lumber, tin, and whatever other materials that were lying around. Anything that people could salvage. Unemployment mansions was made of stone and bricks, and in some cases the structures stood 20 feet high. Most shanties, however, were less ambitious, and they were made from cardboard boxes. Cardboard box homes did not last long, and most dwellings were in a constant state of being rebuilt. Some homes were not buildings at all. Some were deep holes dug into the ground with makeshift roofs laid on top of them to keep out any bitter weather. Some of the homeless found shelter inside empty gutters and empty water mains. But no two Hoovervilles were quite alike, and the camps varied in population and size. Some were as small as a few hundred people, while others that were bigger remained in city areas, such as Washington, D.C. and New York City. St. Louis, Missouri and Seattle, Washington were home of two of the country's largest and longest-standing Hoovervilles. Whenever possible, Hoovervilles were built near rivers for the constant water supply. Some Hoovers were lucky enough to grow a vegetable garden. Some individual shacks contained furniture that some families had managed to carry away upon eviction from their homes. As many as 50,000% of children who grew up during the Depression did not have enough food to eat, health care, or even basic shelter. Many of them developed rickets. Rickets is a preventable disease caused by malnutrients. Today, rickets are rarely seen outside of the world's poorest countries. But what are rickets? Rickets is the softening and weakening of bones in children, usually due to not getting enough vitamin D. Vitamin D helps the body absorb calcium. Extreme or prolonged lack of vitamin D makes it difficult to maintain proper calcium. Symptoms include delay of growth, delay motor skills, bow legs, muscle weakness, and pain in the spine, pelvis, and legs. Treatment may involve adding vitamin D or calcium to the diet. What do rickets look like? Well, it causes skeleton deformities, including thickening of the spine, dental problems, including weak tooth canals, a delay in teeth coming through, and increased risk of cavities. In 1948, a photo was published, and the image was taken featuring a Chicago woman advertising to sell her 4 children. It is presented to be one of perhaps the most distressing and shocking moments ever captured, taken within the 20th century. A young mother hides her face in shame as her 4 children bundled together, no pun intended. In large bold letters, a sign reads, "4 children for sale. Inquire within." The picture deflects the reflection of a young mother, Lucille Calaflax. And looking at the picture depicted from top left to right is Lana, age 6, Ray, age 5, and the bottom left to right is Milton, age 4, and Ellen, age 2. The photo depicts a very serious situation, and it first appeared in a local paper based in Indiana on August 5th, 1978. Sadly, this photo is 100% true, and the children really were up for sale by their parents, and they were in fact purchased by other families. Years later, the children finally shared their side of the story. When the image first appeared, it was accompanied by the sorrowful circumstances surrounding the photograph. A big for sale sign sets in the Chicago yard silently tells the tragic story of Mr. and Mrs. Calaflex, who faced eviction from their apartment. With no place to turn, the jobless coal truck driver and his wife decided to sell their 4 children. According to the Times of the Northwest Indiana, it is unclear how long the sign remained in the yard, and it is unclear how long the sign appeared in the yard before the 4 children's cell did ultimately find themselves separated, split up to different homes to live with complete strangers. And the photo was eventually republished in the papers all over the United States. A few days later, the Chicago Heights Star reported that a woman living in Chicago Heights offered to open her home to the children, and apparently job offer after job offer of financial support made its way to the Calaflex. Unfortunately, none of this seemed to be enough, and 2 years later, after the image first appeared, all of the children, including the one in the womb, were gone. Lucille was pregnant in the photo. So what happened to the children after the photo was taken? The youngest of the children, David, was adopted by kind yet strict parents. Sadly, the same could not be said about the rest of the children. The Calaflex children's father, Ray, abandoned the family when they were young, and he was unable to return home due to his criminal record. Lucille Calaflex accepted governmental assistance and gave birth to the couple's fifth child, David, in 1949. However, only a year later, David was either removed from the home or relocated, just like the children he never knew. David was legally adopted by Harry and Lula McDonald, who officially had custody of him in July 1950, and his condition reflected that the Calaflex's home had not been a good one. He states that, "I had bed bug bites all over my body," and ultimately McDaniels, David's new father's life was stable and safe, maybe a bit strict. He described himself as a rebellious teen and eventually ran away from home at the age of 16 before spending 20 years in the military. After that, David spent his life working as a truck driver. He also grew up only a few miles away from his biological siblings, Rhiann and Milton Calaflex. He even visited them on several occasions, but their situation turns out was to be far worse than his. Rhiann and Milton were chained up in a barn and treated like slaves. Rhiann Mills has said that her birth mother sold her for $2, so that alleged $2 was provided by a couple by the name of John and Ruth Zodeman. They originally intended to only purchase Rhiann, but they noticed Milton crying nearby and decided to take him too. Evidently, they regarded the children more as purchased property than human beings. Milton Calaflex states, "There's not a lot of things in my childhood that I remember." The Zodemans changed Milton's name to Kenneth David Zodeman. On his first day in their home, John Zodeman tied him up and beat him before telling the young boy that he was expected to be a slave on the family's farm. Milton said that he'd go along with it. He said, "I didn't know what a slave was. I was only a kid." Ruth Zodeman, however, cleaned him up after the abuse, and she told him that she loved him, and from then on, he would be her little boy. And the couple changed Rhiann's name to Beverly Zodeman. She describes the couple's home as abusive and loveless. She states that they used to chain us up all the time. When I was a little child, we was field workers. Mills' son, Lance Gray, has often described his mother's life as a horror movie. Not only her teenage years, but later she was kidnapped, raped, and impregnated. Despite all of this, however, she grew into a compassionate and loving mother. He states that, "They don't make 'em like her no more. That woman, tough as nails." The abuse that was inflicted on Milton often manifested as violent rage when he entered his teenage years. At one point, he was brought before a judge, and the judge deemed him as a menace to society. He was then given the option between being sent to a mental institution or a reformatory. He opted to go to the mental hospital, and after being diagnosed with schizophrenia, he eventually left the hospital in 1967, got married, and moved from Chicago to Arizona with his new wife. Although the marriage didn't work out, he remained in Arizona. While Milton and Rhiann have reconnected as adults, the same cannot be said for their sister Lana, who died of cancer in 1998. They did, however, get to speak for a short while with Sue Ellen, and found out that she grew up not far from their original home in Chicago's East Side. By the time the siblings found each other again as adults in 2013, Sue Ellen was in the late stages of lung disease and found it difficult to speak. Fortunately, she was able to scribble responses to an interview on paper. When she was asked how it felt to be reunited with Rhiann, she wrote, "It's fabulous. I love her." And as far as her opinion of her birth mother, she wrote, "She needs to be burning in hell." Yes, the Depression was sad and miserable for every man, woman, and especially for children. Unless your name was Rockefeller. No big surprise there. That family's name has popped up every time the American people are struggling. But there are a couple of incidences worth mentioning that was put on full display in America during the Great Depression. There was an increase in levels of violent crime during the early years of the Depression, but that was followed by a sharp decline in crime in the later years, which raises questions about the crime's relationship to the economy. It's almost as if the government keeps its people poor and in poverty so that they have to commit crimes to live, and it feeds to the income of the government's judicial system. The Great Depression ended in 1939. World War II begun in 1939. So, if you put two and two together, was the American government behind the Depression? Also, the Bonus Army Marchers clashed with police in Washington, D.C. in 1932. Many of the war veterans from World War I had been out of work since the beginning of the Great Depression. The World War Adjustment Act of 1924 had awarded them bonuses in the form of certificates that they could not redeem until 1945. On July 28, 1932, the U.S. Attorney General ordered the veterans removed from all government property. Washington police met with resistance, shot at the protesters, and 2 veterans were wounded and later died. President Herbert Hoover then ordered the U.S. Army to clear the marchers' campsite. Army Chief and Staff Commander of Cavalry Support, supported by 6 tanks. The Bonus Army marchers, with their wives, children, and families, were driven out, and their shelters and belongings were burned. Between 1930 and 1940, the southwestern Great Plains region of the United States suffered a severe drought, labeled as the Dust Bowl. A series of droughts led to devastating dust storms, famine, diseases, and deaths related to breathing in dust. This caused the largest migration in American history. People tried to protect themselves by hanging wet sheets in front of the doorways and windows to filter the dirt, and around 7,000 people died during the Dust Bowl. The death was caused by starvation, accidents caused by traveling out of the Midwest, and from dust pneumonia. Most of the people who died during the Dust Bowl died from lung disease, including dust pneumonia. But now we have reached the end of our story, and it was filled with all kinds of twists and turns along the way, with not many good opportunities to mention. This is not a story that comes straight out of a fiction novel or a movie. This story is 100% true, backed up with facts. And please like the video if you enjoyed it, and follow the channel for more interesting topics. And don't forget to hit that little ringy-dingy thing for more awesome informational content. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your support. And I hope to see you again real soon on the next fantastic episode of Debunking History's Mysteries right here at Conspired Deception.